The World to Come. The Restored Church of God presents David C. Pack, answering life's greatest questions straight from the Bible and announcing the wonderful good news of the world to come.
In this series examining the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, we are finally ready to look at the pale horse of pestilence. This and the next broadcast must also necessarily be very graphic. Disease in all its forms is loathsome to every human being. It has brought untold suffering for millennia to billions of people, many of whom never saw it coming. Disease epidemics, rapid, widespread outbreaks among thousands or even millions of people often strike suddenly. Before authorities can react, the damage is done. Such has been the case throughout history. Of the 59 million people who die each year, about half, almost 30 million, perish from sickness. Think of it. The world loses roughly the equivalent of Canada every year to disease. And it is about to get much worse. The pale horse and rider, the final horse, now enters the picture. The fourth horseman carries a different, broader description and summarizes the horses riding together. I looked, John wrote, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them, all four horses and riders, over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, primarily disease in context, and with the beasts of the earth. The word pale comes from the Greek word chloros, from which derives the name of yellow chlorine gas. It indicates the sickly, pale, yellow-green color of disease. Coming on the heels of the first three horsemen, the pale horseman's arrival portends that hundreds of millions will now perish through terrifying disease pandemics. The reference to death, the end result of disease, and hell, Hades, meaning the grave, make this clear. The portion stating power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth will be covered later in the series. Such mass death worldwide may seem impossible in this sophisticated modern age, where air travel has allowed man to run to and fro across the earth without boundaries, where the tallest building is nearly half a mile high, and where the internet has created a global village connecting every corner of civilization. This is, however, also a time in which men's bodies have degenerated through thousands of years of abuse, where super diseases continually resist even the strongest antibiotics, and where doctors and scientists no longer speak of if a pandemic is coming, but when. As modern medicine seeks to conquer disease, men's governments and their organizations have lost control. Understand, as new diseases emerge and older ones rapidly mutate, modern medicine has fallen far behind in the effort to eradicate them. Today, diseases thought long ago conquered are back with a vengeance. Deadly scourges from the past have re-emerged, this time much more resistant to standard treatments. This, coupled with poor sanitation, war, poverty, and overcrowding, are creating environments ripe for the massive spread of disease. At the same time, the world has become more interconnected than at any other time in history. The advent of relatively cheap, fast air travel means more people now travel abroad. More now also travel for vacations and business, increasing their chances of being infected by foreign viruses or carrying one with them to others. According to a noted Swedish pathologist, infectious diseases have probably been the most dangerous enemies of mankind, much more so than war. The global threat posed by infectious diseases has never been greater. Despite man's best efforts, old scourges such as tuberculosis, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, anthrax, and malaria are still very much alive. Add to this the more recent arrivals of Ebola, hantavirus, E. coli, salmonella, currently now spreading very fast, HIV, West Nile, and swine flu. Understand that these are just a few of the possible epidemics on the horizon. To appreciate the potential impact of any of them, consider HIV. Over 30 million people in the world are HIV positive, and millions more contract the virus every year. To date, more than 25 million have died from AIDS, which originates from HIV, with the certainty of millions more dying. AIDS has been called a viral nightmare that ravages all nations and threatens the very existence of our species. Add the threats of biological war and bioterrorism. The prospect of these is simply too horrifying to contemplate, yet they are real. Recall that in 2001, anthrax broke out in America. Letters laced with it were sent to news media and congressional offices. The event, thought to be an attack by a foreign terrorist, created havoc nationwide. With all of the biological agents, weapons, and terrorists with their networks in circulation today, the danger of a biological attack is a very real threat. Here, the red and pale horses ride together. On top of ever-worsening epidemics, the world's resources, including clean air, water, and food, are being stretched to the limit. Wars between desperate countries competing for scarce resources are increasing in scope and intensity. War leads to famine, which results in disease. This begs a question. Has it always been this way? Or has there been an escalation in the number of disease outbreaks now widespread across the globe? Health authorities admit that an acceleration is underway, especially in the last 50 years. According to a study published by the American Medical Association, death rates from infectious diseases are rising. The United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, recognizes the threat, stating, "We continue to confront new and potentially devastating infectious disease threats." It also noted that the threat of an influenza pandemic is as high as before. The European Society of Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases has also affirmed that infectious diseases are an increasing threat to public health. In the U.S., infectious diseases rose by nearly 60% from 1980 to 1992 and continue to be a leading cause of death in this wealthy country. According to a leading microbiologist, the arrival of an era when antibiotics are useless would be nothing short of a medical disaster. There are more ominous signs of what lies ahead. 1/3 of the world's population now carry germs that cause tuberculosis, and new infections are occurring 1 per second. AIDS is devastating entire regions in sub-Saharan Africa and is spreading rapidly around the world. AIDS and tuberculosis have linked, becoming tandem infections with devastating effect. Scientists now estimate 30% of Earth's population, about 2 billion people, have a form of Staphylococcus aureus, and up to 53 million are thought to be carrying the deadly superbug methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, pronounced MRSA. They say these strains could potentially become explosive in hospitals. Also, in the U.S., outbreaks of waterborne diseases are increasing. Globally, rates of diseases like dengue fever are growing. Outbreaks of insect-transmitted diseases like chikungunya fever are occurring in unexpected locations and are now a threat to even the United States. Diseases long thought conquered are proving more difficult to treat. This is true of a new, more lethal form of C. difficile that is more resistant to drug treatments and can cause a fatal strain of diarrhea. This is but the briefest glance at the growing predicament facing the world. Man has battled disease for as long as there have been people. Soon after creation, human beings encountered microbes that infected their drinking water, food, and environment. As men built cities and began living in confined spaces, the risk of outbreaks increased. One of the earliest known diseases was tuberculosis. Spread person to person through the air, this disease was even found in ancient Egypt. As trade between nations increased, Diseases often proliferated along commercial routes. The impact on those who had not known such diseases was catastrophic. Influenza and the bubonic plague, which spread from Asia to Europe, were examples, as was cholera, an intestinal disease that started in India. After cholera's inception, millions died, and the disease went on to spread across the Middle East, Europe, China, North Africa, and Japan. Eventually, it reached as far as England and America. During the Age of Exploration, in the 15th through 17th centuries, advances in shipbuilding and navigation made it possible to explore foreign lands and develop new territories. This contributed to the spread of disease. One of the most deadly was smallpox, which killed up to 5 million people worldwide from AD 165 to 180, just 15 years in the Antonine Plague, with as many as 5,000 per day purportedly dying in Rome alone. When Europeans arrived in the New World in the 1400s, they brought smallpox. This and other diseases wiped out up to 90 to 95% of the native population. Despite the development of vaccines, smallpox killed between 300 and 500 million people in the 20th century alone. Consider, far more were killed by just this disease in that century than the gun in history. Another very old disease still taking a huge toll is malaria. Carried by mosquitoes, malaria is mentioned in ancient Chinese and Egyptian writings 4,000 years ago. The Greeks described its awful effects as well, and malaria is thought to have aided in the collapse of the Roman Empire. But God never intended man live this way. Notice, I wish above all things, the Apostle John recorded, that you may prosper and be in health, even as your soul or life prospers. After creating Adam and Eve, God said all of his creation was very good. This leaves no room for him having placed hidden, inactive viruses and bacteria in human bodies, waiting for the right moment to afflict them with horrible sickness and disease of every kind. Man did this to himself, inviting disease as a natural consequence of broken laws. These booklets, God's Principles of Healthful Living and the Truth About Healing, will open your eyes to what God always intended. All man's efforts to cure diabetes, arthritis, cancer, heart disease, blindness, deafness, Alzheimer's and other mental diseases, strokes, AIDS, and a host of infant and childhood diseases have failed. Add the ongoing quest for new wonder drugs, treatments, specialized diagnoses, surgeries and procedures, and breakthroughs in technology, plus every other medical advancement. Again, all have failed. Hardly a week goes by without reports of another outbreak somewhere in the world. Headlines like these are common. Rift Valley fever hits South Africa. New strains of Lyme disease bacteria identified. AIDS remains the world's worst epidemic. Dengue fever surges in the Americas. Let's look more closely at one serious disease. Officials worldwide are now reporting the resurgence of dengue fever. Once rare, it is spreading across the world at an alarming rate. So much so that it has become a major international public health concern. In fact, dengue is a leading cause of hospitalization and death of children in many countries. The potential for disaster is immense, with 2.5 billion people living in areas where this virus is found. From 50 to 100 million people are already affected every year. Although usually not yet the fatal hemorrhagic strain, once the disease becomes a pandemic, and there is every indication this could happen, there is greatly increased potential for it to mutate in this direction. It is now even affecting the United States, which has never seen such a surge. In the past, dengue always remained outside its borders. In the last few years, it has slowly been migrating north and is now found across Central America and even American border states. According to health authorities, Dengue cases in the Americas have increased almost fivefold over the past 30 years, skyrocketing from 2.7 million cases in the 1990s to 4.8 million just between 2000 and 2007. This has alarmed authorities on the Texas border, who've also seen a higher number of cases, as has Florida. Puerto Rico is also suffering and has now declared a dengue epidemic. Dengue is just one of dozens of diseases that authorities report are increasing. These and other rapidly spreading diseases paint a grisly picture. Even more dangerous diseases lurk in the shadows. With dwindling numbers of doctors and nurses entering the medical profession, there is very real alarm about the nation's ability to combat these diseases. Notice this. Experts warn there won't be enough doctors to treat the millions of people newly insured under the universal health care law. At current graduation and training rates, the U.S. could face a shortage of as many as 150,000 doctors in just the next 15 years. Compounding this, widespread wars have forced thousands into refugee camps, most of which exist in absolute squalor. These become fertile breeding grounds for disease. Then there are polluted, overcrowded cities, which create contaminated water drunk by most residents. The United Nations estimates that more than half of all hospitalizations are a result of people not having clean water to drink. Children are often most affected. According to the United Nations Children's Fund, 2.6 billion, almost 40% of the world population, live without access to even a toilet at home and thus are vulnerable to a range of health risks. This lack of access to proper sanitation, including clean water, is a major cause of diarrhea, the second biggest killer of children in developing countries, and leads to other major diseases such as cholera, schistosomiasis, a type of worm, and trachoma. Add to this wild immorality, which has caused an explosion of sexually transmitted diseases. As an example of an unprecedented catastrophe unfolding as of August 2010, monsoon rains put 20% of Pakistan underwater, an area larger than the entire nation of England. Some areas have received 180% of normal precipitation for this season. 20 million Pakistanis have lost their homes, with 3.5 million children at severe risk of infection by cholera and other rapidly spreading diseases. Millions face starvation. Aside from the flooding, the situation is worsened by slow arriving international aid due to the global economic downturn and the way the crisis intensified gradually, rather than coming in a single dramatic event like an earthquake or tsunami. Add to this a fragile government being further destabilized, with opportunistic terrorist groups, as well as the Pakistani military, taking advantage of the situation and compounding the mayhem. Clearly, this world is in serious trouble. Mankind is now teetering on the edge of global disease catastrophe. Although skeptics claim huge global pandemics could not happen again because of improved hygiene and sterilization, this is wishful thinking. Some bacteria can already resist antibacterial soaps. These need ever stronger chemicals to kill them. There are others scientists cannot defeat, period. Because of this and other factors, epidemiologists and infectious disease experts report that the threat from infectious diseases is increasing. Infectious disease clearly represents a threat to human security in that it has the potential to affect both the person and his or her ability to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. In addition to threatening the health of an individual, the spread of disease can weaken public confidence in government's ability to respond, have an adverse economic impact, undermine a state's social order, catalyze regional instability, and pose a strategic threat through bioterrorism and/or biowarfare. This prominent research company went on to outline the enormity of the problem facing the world. Consider this. The magnitude and nature of the threat is growing because of the emergence of new illnesses such as acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, Ebola, and hepatitis C. The increasing inability of modern medicine to respond to resistant and emerging pathogens, and the growing threat of bioterrorism and biowarfare. In addition, human actions amplify these trends by putting us in ever greater contact with deadly microbes. Globalization, modern medical practices, urbanization, climatic change, and changing social and behavioral patterns all serve to increase the chance that individuals will come in contact with diseases which they may not be able to survive. The AIDS crisis in South Africa provides a disturbing example of how a pathogen can affect security at all levels, from individual to regional and even to global. Approximately 1/4 of the adult population in South Africa alone is HIV positive, with the disproportionate burden of illness traditionally falling on the most economically and personally productive segment of society. The true impact of the AIDS epidemic is yet to be felt. Deaths from full-blown AIDS are not projected to peak before 2012, and the number of HIV infections is still increasing. Significantly worsening pestilence, disease epidemics, and pandemics are another confirmation the end of the age is here. For the first time in nearly a century, widespread disease epidemics are again knocking at the doors of America and Europe. The 2009 swine flu outbreak evidenced this. According to one epidemiologist, flu is the biggest infectious disease threat in the world today. An August 2009 report for the American president affirmed the experts' predictions. Just this disease could infect 30 to 50% of the entire United States population, up to 150 million people. Authorities stated in the report the H1N1 strain could also cause 1.8 million U.S. hospital admissions during an epidemic, with up to 300,000 patients requiring treatment from intensive care units. Kill 30 to 90,000 in the United States in a typical winter flu season, concentrated among children and young adults. Pose especially high risks for individuals with certain pre-existing conditions, including pregnant women and patients with neurological or respiratory problems, diabetes, or severe obesity, and possibly for certain populations such as Native Americans. Reports from the first wave of the H1 pandemic revealed that a number of hospitals were swamped with patients needing emergency care. Swine flu victims typically require 12 days of mechanical ventilation and frequent use of rescue therapies, such as high-frequency oscillatory ventilation, prone positioning, neuromuscular blockade, and inhaled nitric oxide. Think, what would happen if just 90,000 Americans required these treatments? And just for this type of flu, U.S. hospitals could not keep up with the long lines of patients. Cases in Britain doubled to 100,000 in 1 week in July 2009. The virus had such a significant impact on the country that within minutes of its opening, the National Pandemic Flu Service website crashed. Since the initial estimated figures failed to occur, millions have already forgotten the potential death toll. But H1N1 continued to spread. A map of infected areas shows cases have stricken all corners of the world. So far, the only places where it has not been confirmed are Greenland, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and a few small African nations. The director of the London-based World Influenza Center said the extensive summer outbreak in Britain had not followed expected patterns and warned the Department of Health needed to be prepared for a more deadly form of the disease. A public health professor added, "There are enormous parallels with 1918 and our current pandemic. They are spreading at a similar rate, but we don't know if the virus will mutate. If it does, this is when it could become very dangerous." To many, these numbers seem impossible. Up to 90,000 Americans dead in one season? Those under 50 have never experienced even the possibility of a pandemic so devastating. Typically, about 40,000 die of all forms of flu in the United States for a whole year. Without first-hand experience of a nationwide pandemic, many can only look to history to understand the disease foretold to come on the world in their lifetime, your lifetime. For comparison and perspective, we turn to the worst recorded flu pandemic of all time, the 1918 Spanish flu outbreak. Up to 675,000 in the United States were killed, of a population a third as big as today, along with between 40 to 100 million worldwide. Past pandemics demonstrated an ability to strike quickly, literally overnight, and overwhelm medical services. Such was the 1918 Spanish flu. This pandemic started much the same as the one in 2009. 3 years before the 1918 virus took its worst toll, it first surfaced in birds. From 1915 to 16, America suffered a catastrophic respiratory epidemic, which greatly increased the death toll from pneumonia and flu complications. Although death rates decreased by 1917, weakened immune systems invited the pandemic's first wave in March 1918. The pandemic continued in 3 stages over a 12-month period. The first wave reached Europe, the U.S., and Asia in late spring and summer. A second, more deadly strain appeared 6 months later, wiping out entire families from September to November 1918. A third wave struck in early spring of 1919. Unlike most viruses, which normally affect the very young, the weak, and the elderly, the 1918 flu targeted healthy adults between ages 20 and 40. Victims suffocated as their immune systems broke down, filling their lungs with a reddish liquid which often bubbled out of them as they died. Make yourself grasp the following picture. In 1918, many churches in America closed. So did schools. The government banned public meetings. Businesses collapsed from lack of customers. State institutions became overrun with orphan children, and infected postal carriers were unable to deliver mail. Heaps of rancid garbage lined city streets. Decomposing bodies overflowed from morgues and had to be stored in nearby elementary schools. Wherever people ventured, the smell of rotting flesh haunted them. Imagine this and the following horrific scenarios playing out today, unfolding on the very streets of your hometown. Imagine the disease taking someone close to you, an acquaintance, coworker, friend, or family member. A letter written by a military doctor in September 1918 described the dreadful conditions at Fort Devens near Boston. These men start with what appears to be an attack of la grippe or influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. Later he wrote, "It takes special trains to carry away the dead. For several days there were no coffins and the bodies piled up something fierce. We used to go down to the morgue and look at the boys laid out in long rows. It beats any sight they ever had in France after a battle. An extra long barracks has been vacated for the use of the morgue, and it would make any man sit up and take notice to walk down the long lines of dead soldiers all dressed up and laid out in double rows." There is more to learn about the 1918 flu and what it shows can happen when pandemics arrive. The next broadcast reveals more of this potential, and what Jesus Christ declares will soon strike the whole world in an unprecedented way. Until next time, this is David C. Pack saying goodbye, friends.
This program was made available by Restored Church of God members and donors from around the globe. Explore our vast library of literature and other World to Come programs, which are all made available free of charge. To learn more or to find a local congregation, contact us to receive a personal response from a minister.